I'm David Lee, and I'd like to welcome you all to our program Outside the Book. We're here at the Southern Kentucky Festival of Books, and we've got a lineup of really intriguing authors to spend a little time with today. And the first of these is Bobbie Ann Mason. For some 30 years, Bobbie Ann Mason has been one of the most preeminent writers in American life. In novels and short stories, she's painted a tremendous portrait of the South in change in the years after World War II, and a lot of her stories are rooted in her native Kentucky. Bobbie Ann, thanks very much for being with us on this program here this morning.
Thank you.
You have a new book, The Girl in the Blue Beret, and I'm intrigued by it for a number of reasons, but just as an opening question, why at this stage in your career did you choose to write a book that's set in World War II?
It wasn't a conscious decision. It came upon me. It was inspired by something that happened to my father-in-law during World War II. It was a familiar story to me, but it hadn't occurred to me to make it into a work of fiction until I was taking a French class. And my father-in-law had been a B-17 pilot who was shot down during the war. And the French resistance helped to get him to safety, to get him back to his base in England. And so during the time he was in France, he had to be hidden by people who risked their lives to help him and feed him and hide him. And so when I was taking the French class, I started to think about what it might have been like for him as a 23-year-old aviator stranded in a foreign country with the enemy surrounding him and having to pretend to be French and to not know the language and to have to say bonjour. So one thing led to another, and I realized that there might be a story there. One of his helpers, his guides, had been a girl who wore something blue. He couldn't remember if it was a beret or a scarf, but I seized on The Girl in the Blue Beret, and I thought, there's my title, and I'm taking French, so I'll go to France and find the story.
I'm intrigued with how you did the research. How because this doesn't involve just going to libraries. This is a much more complicated research structure. How did you do that?
There were two things. One is that I read an awful lot of narratives about that experience of aviators trying to get out of Europe who had crash landed or parachuted. There are a lot of narratives, and there are a lot of narratives of the French. So I tried to immerse myself in that experience by reading. And then the second thing is that I went to France and met some people. I met some people who had helped my father-in-law, and they proved to be great inspirations, valuable sources, and ultimately very good friends.
Is this an experience that he talked about a lot, that you heard a lot from him about?
My father-in-law talked about his experience, and he actually wrote a little memoir, and he always made light of it. And when I got involved in reading about it, about crossing the Pyrenees when it's up to his thighs in snow, and about that period in spring of 1944, it was far more dangerous than he admitted, and or maybe even knew at the time. But he tried to make light of it and make a good story out of it. But I was shocked to find out what was really going on during the war and how scary it was, and how much these Europeans risked their lives to help the aviators.
In fact, one of the things the book has been particularly praised for is the window you provide on the French resistance. Tell us a little bit about how you pulled that together.
Well, this is one aspect of the resistance, which is very, very complicated. But the aspect where there were ordinary citizens who wanted to help, who wanted to resist, but didn't want to go up and blow up bridges necessarily, but found themselves pretty helpless. But this was one thing they could do, and they felt it was necessary. They had to do something, and so they truly risked their lives. And when I went over to France and met some of these people, I was just really surprised at how grateful they still were, how hospitable they were to me, how there was a deep bond between them and the aviators, and it went both ways.
So did you find the girl in the blue beret?
One of the women who my father-in-law remembered as the girl in wearing something blue. Yeah. Yes, she was my inspiration. She was wonderful.
Your father-in-law's generation has been described as the greatest generation. How do you feel about that now that you've spent some time with that generation? Not only the Americans, but the Europeans who were part of that generation.
Well, I'm a little distrustful of reductive labels. The war was a lot more complicated, I guess. But I am very impressed by some of these people I've met, and on both sides.
What do you see as the legacy of that generation?
I think it's hard for me to reduce that. They contribute to our nostalgia and our memory, and I don't think they stop us from having wars. I don't think they stopped us from having wars.
It would be nice if that was their legacy.
It would be nice.
Some folks who were involved with the war developed a real affection for the B-17.
Oh, the B-17.
Do you share
so
any of
did
that?
I, yes. And because of the feeling they had for it, because of the danger and the difficulty of flying that machine. And when the Americans got involved in the air war, most of the planes weren't coming back. It took a while for them to get better at it and to decimate the Luftwaffe. So it was a very bold thing that some of these young men did when they got in those B-17s.
Well, your father-in-law, you mentioned, was 23. He's about the age of a college senior.
Yeah.
And he's having this incredible experience.
And loving it, and yet being terrified. And not admitting. It was, I can't quite imagine it myself. I tried so hard, but to try to imagine a young man, because after all, I come at it as a woman, and it's a great leap of imagination to get at what a man is feeling when he wants to go on a bombing mission.
Well, Bobbie Ann, this has been a very interesting conversation, and I really appreciate you making some time for us here on Outside the Book. And The Girl in the Blue Beret is a fascinating read, and I strongly recommend it to folks who are interested in a special perspective on an aspect of the Second World War that's perhaps a bit overlooked.
And it's a love story, too, don't forget.
Absolutely.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you.
Our guest has been Bobbie Ann Mason. And we're back with Outside the Book, and our guest now is Robert Morgan, a longtime faculty member since 1971 at Cornell University, and one of America's preeminent men of letters. He's a poet, he writes novels, he writes fiction and nonfiction. He has an incredible facility for the written word and the ability to communicate folks in a variety of literary styles. At this point in his career, he's done a lot of history, and that interests me in particular. So, Robert, thank you very much for joining us here on Outside the Book.
Oh, it's very good to be here.
You have at least made a bit of a transition to become a historian in the latter part of your career. What's taken you in that direction with your books about Boone and about the Lions of the West, the folks who've kind of taken us on the westward movement?
Well, I've always been interested in history, so it's not a completely new thing for me. And I grew up on a farm, finding arrowheads and pieces of Indian pottery. My dad was a great fan of Daniel Boone and the frontiersman, used to talk about it, so it's not a completely new thing. And in fact, I haven't given up fiction writing. I have a sequel to Gap Creek coming out next year. But I think as I got older, I became more and more interested in the history of this country, and particularly in the westward expansion, the frontier. I'm related to Daniel Boone distantly, though I think practically half the people in the country are related to Daniel Boone. And one thing led to another. The novel called Brave Enemies, which is set in the American Revolution, came out in 2003. I did a lot of research on the revolutionary period in the South for that. That's what led me directly to writing about Daniel Boone and the Piedmont and mountain frontier in the 18th century and the revolutionary period. I got so involved in studying Daniel Boone and the Indians of his time. I got to come to Kentucky at least a dozen times. Had a good excuse to keep coming back to the Blue Licks battlefield, to Boonesboro, to the Licking River where he had lived. And when I finished Boone, my publisher said, "What would you like to do next?" And I said, well, I would kind of like to follow the story of the westward expansion after Daniel Boone. So we talked about maybe a biography of David Crockett or Sam Houston, Kit Carson. But I remember saying to my publisher, of course, the great leader who was most interested in the westward expansion and most influential was probably Thomas Jefferson. And the person who actually negotiated the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1847-48, buying the West from Mexico, was Jefferson's grandson-in-law, Nicholas P. Trist, who for $15 million bought New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, half of Colorado, a chunk of Wyoming. And my publisher said, oh, that's it. A story that begins with Jefferson and ends with his grandson-in-law.
How did you choose the 10 people that you've included in this book?
It was difficult because there's so many people I could have written about. There are more Indian leaders I could have written about, like Tecumseh, for instance. Thomas Hart Benton would have obviously been a very good figure to write about. But I decided I would write about figures for whom there was one particular event that defined their contribution to the westward expansion. In the case of Jefferson, it'd be buying Louisiana and sending Lewis and Clark up the Missouri all the way to the Pacific. For Andrew Jackson, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, March of 1814, where he defeated the Creek Red Stick rebels, and therefore opened Georgia and much of Alabama to settlement. Sam Houston, the Battle of San Jacinto. The odd figure in my book is Johnny Appleseed.
Well, yes.
Because here's somebody who's involved in the westward expansion who didn't kill Indians, didn't fight any battles, in fact was a missionary who was out planting seeds, apple trees, and spreading Swedenborgian theology, he thought. I just had to include Johnny Appleseed as the great exception. The center of the book is James K. Polk, who was the president who provoked war with Mexico and then forced Mexico to cede all that land of the West. There's a chapter on Winfield Scott, the great victor who conquered Mexico in 1847. Kit Carson, born here in Kentucky, grew up in Missouri, and is the greatest of the frontiersmen of the 19th century. Related to Daniel Boone. There were marriages between the Boones and the Carsons.
I guess one person who's not there that I'm intrigued by a bit, particularly given the Jefferson theme, is Meriwether Lewis. Why would you not include Lewis in this?
I decided not to include the Lewis and Clark expedition in detail because so much has been done on them recently that most readers interested in this period already know a lot about Lewis and Clark. So I concentrate on Jefferson's letter of commission to them and the long foreground of Jefferson's planning of that expedition, assuming that almost all my readers will have read one of the famous books, Stephen Ambrose's book, or seen the series on television, Ken Burns' series on Lewis and Clark. Yes, and I could have included a chapter on Boone as far as that goes. He's one of the great figures. But the book got so long, my publisher said, we've got to limit it to 10 people. We can't do any more.
As a historian, I continue to be intrigued, like a lot of folks are, with Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, and the notion that the frontier defined the United States. Particularly as you've worked on this book, what do you see as the legacy of the westward expansion movement in the United States? Was Turner onto something, but he maybe could have expressed it differently? What would be your version of the frontier thesis?
Well, I think that Turner is essentially right, that the settlement of the wilderness and the West helped define the American character in ways that really could not be traced exactly back to Europe, that this was something different. It weren't just Europeans who happened to be in North America, but by the time of the westward expansion, there was a different culture, a different kind of personality. So I'm a great fan of Frederick Jackson Turner. His thesis doesn't explain everything, as many modern historians have pointed out. But he was right there in Wisconsin as a young man. He had the benefit of the Draper collection and the insights of Lyman Copeland Draper and this school of Wisconsin historiography. And I think to a great extent, he really is one of the finest American historians, and he recognized this thing that was different, that had to do with the aggressiveness on the one hand, the dreaming, the desire, the poetry of the West. And in some ways, he's never been surpassed, really. His breakthrough, I think about 1893, when he published the first essay, has defined an awful lot of American history since. Of course, every generation of historians feels it has to be digging up some new material and some new insights, and there have been many new insights. But it would be hard to think of anything that surpasses the watershed that we associate with Jackson in the late 19th century.
Your 10 Lions of the West are pretty much political leaders, soldiers, men whose, with some exceptions, careers to a large extent have been touched by violence. Is the westward expansion a story of violence?
Oh, to a great extent it is. The killing of Indians and Hispanic people, clearing out indigenous people. It's by turns one of the most violent stories we know, and by turns one of the most admirable stories. The subtitle of the book is Heroes and Villains. Yeah. I've often been asked who are the heroes and who are the villains, and except for Johnny Appleseed, I think each of them is at times a hero and at times a villain.
I'm interested in the time frame you came up with this, because I think it's very creative, from Jefferson's birth to the gold rush. How did that, and that's pretty close to 100 years, how did that structure come to you as the context for the book?
It came to me gradually as I started out working on Jefferson, studying his letters of commission to George Rogers Clark, to Andre Michaud, then of course to Meriwether Lewis. And then I knew I was going to end with the Mexican War, because that took the country to the Pacific. So that just fell into place organically. If you begin with Jefferson and then end with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mm-hmm. The difficulty and the paradox of my book is that I believe the real work of westward expansion was done by the tens of thousands of nameless people, for the most part, who went to Texas, who went to Kentucky, who went into Tennessee and Arkansas, eventually to Oregon and to California. That's what really took the country to the West. It was the people who led, and the generals and the government who followed, pretty much. And the Mexicans understood that. I spent a lot of time studying Mexican historians, and that's one of the things they point out, is that it was less the government of the United States than all these people who just kept plowing ahead into the territory and settling Texas, settling Arkansas, and then California. I mean, if you get more Americans in California than Mexicans, it's not that hard to take it over.
Robert, this is a fascinating story, and I appreciate the very special window you've given us on this uniquely American experience.
Well, I've enjoyed talking to you.
Our guest on this segment of Outside the Book is Robert Morgan, the author of Lions of the West. We're back to Outside the Book, and our guest is Virginia Willis. The Chicago Tribune says that she is one of 7 food writers to watch. That sounds like a pretty positive endorsement. And her books are Bon Appetit, y'all, and Basic to Brilliant, y'all. So, Virginia, it's very nice to have you with us on Outside the Book.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
So, one of your stocks in trade is that you give French cuisine a kind of Southern twist. How do you do that?
It's so natural to me. I'm Southern, grew up in the South, but I also spent time in Louisiana. So I had a little bit of influences there. My mother cooked Cajun and Creole. But more than anything, I love to cook. I've always loved to cook. And I went to French culinary school. So I learned French techniques and the way of French cooking, and I've just simply sort of married the two. It seemed like a natural combination for me.
How did you learn to cook? Is this something you did with your grandmother as a child? Or?
Very much so. And so my first book, Bon Appetit, y'all, is recipes and stories from 3 generations. So there are pictures of me 3 years old making biscuits with my grandmother. And one of my favorite news stories my mama just told me a couple weeks ago is that my grandmother had a double steel sink, and she'd have the peas or the butter beans or whatever in one of the sides of the steel sink, shelling them. And then she would put me as a toddler in the other side of the sink and just sit there and talk to me as she shelled her peas. So I feel like I've been in the kitchen my whole life.
Bon Appetit, y'all, was chosen as the Comfort Food Book of the Year. I mean, that sounds like a pretty wonderful accolade. What does comfort food mean to you?
Oh, I really can't think of much more comfort than, rice and gravy and biscuits and things like that. I think comfort food is a familiar food, and even though rice and gravy and biscuits are very Southern dishes, I think that sort of everyone can identify with that. And it's food that's easy and familiar and not too strange of ingredients or ways of cooking, and it's food that people like.
Well, there tends to be an emphasis in our society for folks who are interested in French cooking to prepare it in the most authentic and quote-unquote purest way. You basically said a little bit of a Southern twist would be a better way to go. How did you get that idea?
Well, I think honestly though, my sort of have 2 sort of major thought processes when it comes to food. And first of all is that I think that country-style cooking is country-style cooking pretty much all over the world, especially in the Western Hemisphere. So we call it chicken stew, and in France it's coq au vin, and in Italy it's chicken cacciatore. And essentially, it's the same way of cooking. The technique's the same. You brown it on both sides, you put it in the oven with some stock or gravy, and you cook it. So in terms of country French cooking, people have this perception that all French cooking is fancy. But all French cooking isn't fancy. There's a lot of authentic home-style cooking that's not too different from what you might find here in Kentucky or in Georgia.
There seems to be a particular interest in food right now in American society. Where's that come from?
I feel that we are becoming increasingly interested in where our food comes from. I feel like that we have sort of strayed away from that, and we're not as familiar with where our food comes from. And also, you can't discount the popularity of something like the Food Network. A whole generation has grown up watching Food Network as entertainment and as education, and I think it's spawned some natural curiosity with people.
Virginia, I think I'm going to take your book home and prepare my supper out of it this evening.
That sounds good.
Thanks for being with us on
It's been
Outside
a
the Book.
Thank you so much.
We've been with Virginia Willis on Outside the Book. Joining us now on Outside the Book is Maggie Green. She's the owner of the Green Apron Company, and she edited the 75th anniversary edition of The Joy of Cooking. Her most recent book is the Kentucky Fresh Cookbook. Maggie, thanks very much for joining us on Outside the Book.
Thank you for having me.
Could you give us a cook's tour of the Kentucky Fresh Cookbook?
Sure. The book is a 12-chapter book, and there's one chapter for every month. So it's a January through December cooking journey through a Kentucky year. I use the concept of seasonal cooking so that people are cooking with different ingredients throughout the year, and then also different cooking methods depending on if it's winter, spring, summer, or fall. And then there's also holidays and Kentucky traditional, like the Derby, thrown in, menus that surround those different events.
It's the Kentucky Fresh Cookbook.
Right.
What makes Kentucky cooking distinctive?
Well, we have a lot of unique ingredients that are available here. I talk a little bit about the use of buttermilk, cornmeal, black walnuts, even bourbon used in cooking, things that are really kind of unique to Kentucky. Now, those things are available in other states, but Kentucky cooking, even historically, has used black walnuts in their cooking, mainly because black walnuts tree grow wild here in Kentucky, and that was always something that was available for cooking in Kentucky. And I don't live on a farm. I don't garden. I don't have a huge garden, but I wrote this book for people who wanted to eat more locally and seasonally when they maybe even had a life that was outside of an agrarian lifestyle.
Who influenced you as a cook, either within your family or outside your family?
I think that within my family, I grew up in a big family in Lexington. I am from Kentucky, and cooking from my mother's perspective, she did it for our family, and we always had fresh food, but I always sensed it was kind of a chore for her because I think of the volume of food that she had to cook.
Yeah.
But that was an inspiration because cooking every day for a family or for whoever you cook for is not always quote unquote fun like a hobby. It is kind of a commitment to feeding people. So that was an inspiration, but in a different sort of way. My real inspiration came from, I went to UK and got my degree in food and nutrition. And when I started working as a dietitian in hospitals, and I really realized that most of the people in Kentucky where I lived got their nutrition through what they ate at home and not necessarily what they were maybe being fed in the hospital. So I went to culinary school in Louisville and got training in the culinary arts and combined my nutrition studies with the study of cooking and food. And that really spurred my interest in how people are eating at home and what they're cooking at home so that they try to feed themselves better and feed their families better.
Why do you think this has become such an important thing in our society? I mean, we invented fast food. We've eaten it happily for years.
Well,
why is slow food back in vogue?
I think it's more enjoyable. I think that it's more fun to sit down to a meal that someone has prepared for you. You can kind of linger over the meal and talk and have a conversation. Also, I think it's important that food isn't necessarily the same in America from coast to coast. But a lot of the chain restaurants lead you to believe that it is. If you go to Applebee's in Bowling Green and then you travel to St. Louis and go to Applebee's, it's pretty much the same thing. But I really believe that there's been an interest in regional American cooking and even the cooking of Kentucky because you can get things that are indigenous to your state, maybe things that grow differently here in Kentucky. Farmers markets are a perfect place to see the different kinds and varieties of things that people are growing, and it lends more variety to what we eat, not necessarily just what we can buy in a restaurant or in a supermarket produce department.
Well, Maggie, thanks for introducing us to wonderful things that are literally in our backyard and the importance of local food.
Thank you.
Enjoy it very much.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Our guest on this segment of Outside the Book has been Maggie Green. And for Outside the Book here at the Southern Kentucky Festival of Books, I'm David Lee.